She was just 5 years old, standing in silk and gold, her face immortalized on canvas. In Diego Velázquez's Las Meninas, she appears luminous, almost angelic, the perfect royal child. But what the painting doesn't show is this: her fate was already sealed. The little girl with the solemn gaze would be married to her own uncle. She would endure 6 pregnancies by the age of 21, and she would die alone, broken and forgotten, all in service of a dynasty obsessed with its own blood. Her name was Margarita Theresa of Spain, and she was born to a family that had turned incest into doctrine. Her father, King Philip IV of Spain, married his own niece. That niece, Mariana of Austria, gave birth to Margarita, a child who was genetically closer to a lab experiment than a human being. In the Spanish royal court of the 17th century, children were not raised for love. They were currency, and Margarita was among the most valuable Spain had left. The empire was crumbling, plagued by military defeat, economic ruin, and rising unrest. Philip, aging and desperate, looked to his daughter not as a person, but as a political tool. Her destiny was not hers to choose. Inside the Alcazar of Madrid, she lived in a palace gilded with rot. Her world was one of silent corridors, cold protocol, and the constant surveillance of advisors more concerned with her fertility than her happiness. Her tutors didn't teach her to dream. They trained her like a package preparing to be shipped, and she would be shipped to Vienna, to her mother's brother, her future husband, her uncle. The Spanish Habsburgs had spent centuries twisting their family tree into a closed loop. By Margarita's time, it was more knot than lineage. Marriages between uncles and nieces, cousins and cousins had become the norm, not out of love, but to keep land, titles, and power sealed within the same blood. But that same blood was starting to betray them. Margarita was born with the full weight of that policy inside her veins. Her father, Philip IV, was already the product of generations of incest. Her mother, Mariana, was Philip's own niece, which meant Margarita wasn't just a royal child. She was the concentrated result of genetic obsession. Her family didn't just break the rules of biology, they ignored them entirely. At court, no one spoke aloud about the consequences, but everyone could see them. The so-called Habsburg jaw, the grotesquely protruding chin, the speech difficulties, the digestive issues, had become an unmistakable signature. Children were born with mental disabilities, skeletal deformities, and lifelong illnesses. And yet, the answer was always the same: marry closer. Keep it pure. In other royal courts across Europe, distant cousin marriages had begun to replace direct bloodlines. But in Madrid, the fantasy of bloodline purity was treated as divine law. Court doctors examined Margarita not for health, but for breeding potential. Reports were filed on her posture, her complexion, her development. She wasn't growing up, she was being evaluated like livestock. By the time she turned 10, potential suitors were already being reviewed, and one name kept returning to the top of the list: Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, her uncle. Leopold I was already 23 when discussions of marriage began. A Habsburg to his core, devout, politically shrewd, and bound by the same twisted duty to keep the bloodline intact. He was also Margarita Theresa's maternal uncle, but in the Habsburg dynasty, that wasn't a problem. It was the point. To the Spanish court, the match made perfect sense. Philip IV's only male heir was sickly and unlikely to survive childhood. If the Spanish line collapsed, the only way to preserve Habsburg control across Europe was to merge it with the Austrian branch. Margarita was the key to that merger. Her uterus, not her will, not her mind, was what mattered. The negotiations unfolded like a trade deal. Vienna wanted guarantees, proof of Margarita's health, assurances of her fertility, territorial concessions. Madrid, in return, offered portraits of her, letters praising her charm, and meticulous reports from doctors. These weren't wedding plans. They were breeding documents. Margarita, of course, had no say in any of it. Her tutors intensified her lessons in German and Latin. Her religious education shifted toward Austrian customs. Everything about her daily routine, from the way she walked to the prayers she recited, was recalibrated to match the preferences of her future husband. Her value was in being seamless, adaptable, pleasing. Behind closed doors, even her diet was controlled. Too much sugar might harm her complexion. Too much activity might injure her posture. Everything she consumed, food, books, air, was filtered through the lens of dynastic preparation. And always the unspoken expectation lingered. Bear children. Male ones, if possible. She was 11. She had never left Spain. She had never made a single decision about her own life. At 12, Margaret Theresa was officially engaged to Leopold. The wedding would take place years later, but preparations began immediately. Her body still small, her voice still childlike, she was already being groomed as an empress-to-be. The Spanish court intensified its efforts, turning her from a child into a symbol, and eventually into a sacrifice. Artists captured her image obsessively. Velázquez painted her not just once, but again and again, each time more poised, more composed, more royal. The portraits were political tools sent abroad to reassure the Austrian court that she was healthy, beautiful, and ready. Each brushstroke was part of the negotiation. Privately, however, signs of strain began to appear. Palace doctors examined her more frequently. Letters hinted at fatigue, headaches, and emotional withdrawal, but nothing could be allowed to interfere with the plan. Her value to the empire outweighed her discomfort. She was reminded of that daily, through silence, through supervision, through the tightening noose of expectation. By 13, Margarita knew what awaited her. No one explained the details. No one asked if she was afraid. But she wasn't naive. She had seen what marriage had done to her own mother. Married at 14, pregnant within the year, increasingly isolated in a palace that didn't tolerate weakness. Even so, she smiled in public. She curtsied, recited prayers, and memorized court customs that would serve her in Vienna. Her obedience wasn't just learned, it was extracted. And all the while, Europe watched. The engagement was seen as a symbol of Habsburg strength, but behind the pageantry, an empire was quietly decaying. At the center of it stood a teenage girl, polished to perfection, and being led to the edge of a cliff. In 1666, at just 14 years old, Margareta Theresa left Madrid for Vienna. The departure was ceremonial, public farewells, blessing from the church, weeping courtiers. But beneath the layers of silk and ritual, a young girl was being permanently exiled from the only world she had ever known. The journey took weeks. Carriages, escorts, stops in foreign courts where she was displayed like a diplomatic trophy. Everywhere she went, people gawked. She was famous, not for anything she had done, but for what she represented, the final hope of uniting the Spanish and Austrian thrones through blood. When she arrived in Vienna, Leopold was waiting. She hadn't seen him in years. He was now 26, quiet, intellectual, and steeped in the rigid etiquette of the Austrian court. He greeted her not as a husband, but as a monarch receiving an obligation. Their wedding was grand. Trumpets, lace, gold-threaded vestments. The Habsburgs knew how to perform power, even as it slipped through their fingers. The ceremony was attended by Europe's most powerful figures. But for Margarita, it marked the beginning of her final transformation. From princess to wife, from girl to tool of dynastic continuity. Almost immediately, the pressure to produce an heir became overwhelming. She was still physically developing, but that didn't matter. She was examined again, now by Austrian physicians. Reports continued. Uterine health, menstruation patterns, signs of reproductive readiness. Her privacy was gone. Her body had become a public project. Pregnancy followed within the first year. Then a miscarriage. Then another. Her health declined. Her letters grew shorter, more formal, stripped of warmth. Whatever childlike spirit she once had, the one captured in Las Meninas, was gone. She was 16, and her body was already breaking under the weight of her role. By 17, Margaret Theresa had endured multiple pregnancies, most ending in loss. When a child did survive birth, it often died within weeks. Her letters, once filled with effort to sound hopeful, turned sparse and mechanical. She wrote less about herself, more about duty, about pleasing the court, about God's will. The Habsburg court offered no refuge. Vienna was colder, stricter than Madrid, its protocols suffocating. Every gesture was judged, every word measured. She was no longer seen as a daughter of Spain, but as property transferred between empires. Even in private, she was referred to by her title, not her name. Doctors treated her like a vessel. The miscarriages were blamed on her constitution, never on the fact that she was being pushed to give birth before her body had fully matured. Rest was limited. Diets adjusted, not for recovery, but for breeding strength. Her health continued to decline, but the pressure never did. Behind closed doors, Leopold was not cruel, but he was distant. Their union was political, not affectionate. He often left her alone for weeks, absorbed in imperial duties and religious study. She was left in palaces filled with mirrors and marble, but no warmth. Her isolation grew. Outside the palace, Europe was shifting. France was rising. The Ottoman threat was growing. But inside the walls of Vienna, Habsburgs clung to rituals and bloodlines, as if time itself could be stopped through tradition. Margarita's suffering was seen not as tragedy, but as inevitability, the cost of legacy. No one asked if she was in pain. No one cared that she could barely walk some mornings. As long as she kept trying to produce an heir, she was fulfilling her purpose. At 18, she was dying slowly, and no one dared to say it. Margarita's body continued to fail her. She suffered from chronic infections, intense abdominal pain, and exhaustion that left her bedridden for days. Doctors prescribed rest, tonics, prayer, anything but the one thing she needed: an end to the pregnancies that were slowly killing her. But stopping wasn't an option. The dynasty needed heirs, the empire needed symbols, and Margaret Theresa, frail and ghost-like, still carried the weight of both. Every miscarriage brought whispers. Every funeral for an infant brought judgment, not of the system, of her. As if her suffering was a personal flaw, not the product of centuries of inbreeding and political blindness. Her appearance changed. Once celebrated for her golden hair and porcelain skin, she now looked pale, swollen, tired beyond her years. Her eyes, once steady and direct in Velázquez's portrait, now avoided mirrors. She wrote to her former confessor in Spain, not asking for help, but for forgiveness. "If I have not served well, may God forgive me. I gave everything that was asked." Leopold, perhaps out of guilt, grew more attentive in her final year. He ordered special physicians. He approved extended stays in warmer climates. But it was too late. Her organs were failing. A final pregnancy, her sixth, nearly killed her. She delivered a weak daughter and never recovered. She spent her last weeks mostly in silence. Palace staff described her as calm, serene, resigned. But those were court words, euphemisms for a woman too broken to protest anymore. She had been drained of everything, even resistance. Margaret Theresa died in March 1673. She was 21. Her death was marked by a solemn state funeral in Vienna. But in Madrid, the court barely paused. Another girl, another royal loss. The empire moved on. Margaret Theresa's death did not end the Habsburg experiment. It merely confirmed its failure. Her surviving daughter was sickly, unlikely to live past infancy, and her own body, upon autopsy, revealed the toll: severe uterine damage, internal hemorrhaging, organ deterioration. Quietly, court doctors acknowledged what no one dared say aloud. She had died of being a Habsburg. But the dynasty pressed on. Leopold remarried to another niece. The logic never changed. Even as more children were born with deformities, even as royal funerals became routine, the strategy held: keep the bloodline pure, no matter the cost. Science had not yet provided the vocabulary for what was happening: genetic disorders, recessive traits, but the evidence was everywhere. And still, it was ignored. The Spanish Habsburgs fell into further decline. Margarita's brother, Charles II, born of the same inbred union that had produced her, would become king, and perhaps the most tragic symbol of Habsburg decay. He was physically deformed, mentally delayed, and politically incapable. His reign was marked by instability, disease, and the slow disintegration of Spain as a global power. He died childless. The bloodline ended with him. In the end, Margarita's death wasn't just personal, it was prophetic. She represented the last flicker of a system that believed it could outwit nature, morality, and time itself through ritual and control. Her life and the destruction of it became the final echo of a dynasty collapsing under its own delusions. But none of this was her choice. She had been 5 years old when Velázquez painted her, eyes full of light, unaware of the machine already grinding her life down to dust. Centuries later, tourists still gather around Velázquez's Las Meninas in Madrid's Prado Museum. They marvel at the brushwork, the composition, the brilliance of the Spanish Golden Age. But most of them don't realize what they're truly looking at. The golden-haired girl at the center, poised, radiant, impossibly still, is a ghost. That painting is not just a masterpiece, it's a tomb. Velázquez didn't merely capture a moment, he captured the last breath of Habsburg Spain before its final collapse. Margaret Theresa stands surrounded by attendants, dwarfed by palace walls, watched by her own parents from the shadows. She is the center of the canvas, but not the center of her own life. It's the only moment of freedom she ever had. A brief pause before the demands of power closed in on her. A girl caught in a single beam of light, frozen just before the fall. The brilliance of the art has long obscured the horror of the story. Viewers see a princess, not a prisoner. They see elegance, not entrapment. They admire the composition, but miss the structure of control, the choreography of grooming, the precision of sacrifice. Historians have since reconstructed Margarita's life in detail. Letters, diaries, medical records, and court documents form a grim mosaic. They reveal a life lived on rails, where even sorrow was prescribed. No act of rebellion, no cry for help, just obedience, endurance, and slow disintegration. Today she is often remembered as a symbol of royal fragility. But that too is a kind lie. She wasn't fragile. She was destroyed by a system that mistook incest for strength and submission for virtue. The tragedy of Margareta Theresa isn't confined to a palace, a painting, or even a dynasty. It's the story of what happens when power devours the people it's supposed to protect. When bloodlines matter more than lives, when children become strategies, her life reduced to duty, her body reduced to function, her death reduced to silence, and yet her image remains, immortalized not by the empire that used her, but by an artist who saw something beyond the crown. In Las Meninas, Velázquez broke every rule of royal portraiture. He didn't paint her as a doll or a symbol. He painted her as a child, real, present, human. He knew, perhaps better than anyone, what was being taken from her. That's why her eyes hold us. They are not just eyes of nobility. They are eyes of someone watching, waiting, maybe even pleading. She stands at the center of the royal machine, luminous but locked in. And she's looking straight at us. Maybe she always was, because the true weight of this story isn't historical. It's eternal. It asks what we still sacrifice in the name of tradition, legacy, control. It asks how many more daughters must be silenced before someone says, enough. Margareta Theresa never chose her fate, but we can choose how we remember her. Not as a princess in a painting, but as a girl, bright, brave, and buried under the crushing weight of an empire that forgot she was alive.